Chapter 1. Clear skies, blue rain. August 7th, 1994, Oakville, Washington. In this corner of the Pacific Northwest, rain isn't an event, it's a constant. It's the gray heartbeat of the lumber country. People here don't just live with the rain, they measure their lives by it. On a normal morning, the clouds roll in from the coast like a bruised ink wash, heavy with the scent of pine and wet asphalt. But at 3 a.m., the rhythm changed. If you were awake, you heard it. It wasn't the rhythmic tapping of water on cedar shingles. It was a duller sound, thicker. A series of heavy, wet thuds, like thousands of tiny, soft stones hitting the rooftops. Imagine the 90s aesthetic of a small town at night. The flickering orange glow of sodium vapor streetlights, the deep, heavy shadows of the Douglas firs, and a fog so thick it looks like it was drawn with a charcoal stick. But as the sun began to struggle against the mist, the residents of Oakville didn't find puddles. They found the gel. Translucent, marble-sized grains of a substance that shouldn't exist. It covered the porches, it choked the gutters, and on the windshields of the early commuters, it turned the simple act of driving into a descent into a blurred, translucent nightmare.
I remember the sound first. It was wrong. It didn't splash. It landed. I went out to my porch with a cup of coffee, still half asleep, thinking maybe it was just a strange summer hail. But the air felt heavy. It smelled like old electricity and something metallic. I looked down at my boots, and the porch was covered in these little whitish blobs. They looked like grains of rice, but when I touched one, it didn't break. It was squishy, like a piece of gelatin that had been left out in the heat. I looked at my dog, Max. He was sniffing at a cluster of them near the stairs. I should have pulled him away. I should have known that clouds don't cry salt water. They cry something else.
Dispatch, this is Lacey. I'm on Highway 12, just outside the city limits. I've got some kind of substance on my windshield. I turned on the wipers and it's smearing. It's like someone threw a bucket of Vaseline at the cruiser. I can't see a thing. It's not washing off with the fluid. It's thick, like a heavy grease. I'm pulling over. The whole road is slick with this stuff. It's like the sky just vomited oil all over the county. Wait. Dispatch, do you hear that? There's a hum. A low, rhythmic thrumming coming from the clouds. It sounds like a heavy engine at high altitude. But the radar is clear. There's nothing up there but the rain.
Officer Lacey was the first to report the physical obstruction, but he wouldn't be the last. Within 2 hours, the Oakville Blobs had coated over 50 square miles. It was a silent invasion of matter that defied the laws of meteorology. And then, the vertigo started. The town was about to find out that this rain didn't just blur the vision, it was designed to enter the blood. Chapter 2. The Sickness. Within 24 hours, the heartbeat of Oakville began to fail. It wasn't a sudden cardiac arrest, but a slow, agonizing arrhythmia. The gel hadn't just coated the streets, it had entered the local ecosystem. It was on the skin of the children playing in the yards, in the lungs of the elderly breathing the humid Washington air, and in the water bowls of the livestock. Imagine a 90s cartoon sequence where the vibrant colors of a suburban morning slowly bleed out, replaced by a sickly, flickering yellow. The sun is a pale, hazy orb behind a veil of toxic mist. This wasn't a flu. The flu doesn't make the horizon tilt at a 45-degree angle. The flu doesn't last for 3 months. This was a biological takeover.
I woke up that Tuesday and the world wouldn't stay still. Have you ever spun around in circles until you fell? It was like that, but I was lying in bed. The ceiling was a whirlpool of white plaster. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt like they were made of water. I collapsed against the dresser, knocking over everything. I couldn't breathe. It felt like my lungs were filled with damp wool. But the sickness in me wasn't the worst part. It was the silence outside. Usually, the woods behind my house are loud with crows. They're annoying, but they're alive. That morning, nothing. I crawled to the window and looked out at the lawn. They were everywhere. Little black heaps in the grass, 12 of them. Crows, just dead. They didn't look sick. They looked like their hearts had just stopped mid-flight. And then I found my kitten, Barnaby. He was by the porch. He was foam at the mouth, shaking, his little body just giving up. I held him, and his fur felt slimy, like he'd been dipped in that damn rain.
Sunny wasn't an isolated case. In the local clinic, the waiting room was a sea of pale faces and trembling hands. People were crawling through the doors because they couldn't walk. The doctors were baffled. No fever, no typical viral markers, just a profound, devastating neurological collapse. But it was the local veterinarian who first noticed the pattern. Dogs, cats, cows. The animals were the canaries in the coal mine. They were dying of massive internal hemorrhaging and respiratory failure within hours of contact with the gel. The residents began to realize that Oakville had become a laboratory, a 52-square-kilometer petri dish. And something was watching them through the microscope.
Listen, I don't care what the Department of Health says. This is not a flu-like illness. I've seen 3 patients today with the same strange, translucent film in the back of their throats. It looks like the gel, like it's growing. I have to go. There are men here, men in gray suits. They aren't doctors. They're taking the blood samples. They're taking everything.
The panic was setting in, but the real nightmare was just beginning. Because while the people of Oakville were fighting for their lives, a man named Mike McDowell was about to put a sample of that rain under a lens. And what he found would haunt the archives of the Arcana Logs forever. Chapter 3. Under the Lens. While the streets of Oakville were drowning in a silent, dizzying sickness, the mystery moved from the gutters to the sterile glow of the laboratory. In 1994, microbiology wasn't about high-speed sequencing or cloud-based data. It was about a man, a glass slide, and the flickering light of a halogen bulb. Imagine a dimly lit room, filled with the hum of old refrigeration units and the scratching of a pen on a paper log. The aesthetic is pure 90s industrial noir. Heavy shadows, green-tinted computer monitors, and the smell of cedar wood mixed with rubbing alcohol. Mike McDowell, a microbiologist at the Washington State Department of Health, was about to peer into a world that should not have existed.
The sample arrived in a standard sterile container.
But it didn't behave like any atmospheric precipitate I'd ever seen. It was dense, rubbery. I prepared the slide, stained it, and adjusted the focus. At first, I thought my equipment was faulty. I thought the stain had contaminated the sample. I was looking at cells, complex biological structures. I saw them clearly. White blood cells, leukocytes. But they were wrong. They were floating in this synthetic, gelatinous matrix. I called the local hospital. I told them, I have white blood cells here. Human cells. They fell from the sky. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. How do you explain a storm made of human waste? Or worse, a storm made of human parts?
But the horror didn't stop at the leukocytes. McDowell pushed the magnification further. He found life where there should only have been chemical residue. Two specific bacteria were thriving in the gel: Pseudomonas fluorescens and Enterobacter cloacei. These weren't space germs. They were terrestrial, common. But in this concentration, delivered via a synthetic hydrogel, they weren't a natural occurrence. They were a payload.
Then the corrections started. Official reports began to circulate, claiming the cells didn't have nuclei. They said they were non-human. They tried to tell me I was seeing things. I've spent 20 years behind a microscope. I know a nucleus when I see one. I went to re-examine my primary samples. I wanted to run a second series of tests. The cabinet was empty. The logs were wiped. My supervisor looked me in the eye and told me there was no Oakville file. It was like the state had reached out and bleached the reality right off the slides. If it wasn't for the sick people in the hallways, I would have thought I'd lost my mind.
The samples were gone. The data was misplaced, but the biological signature remained in the bodies of the victims. As McDowell was being silenced, the skies over Oakville were no longer empty. The hum that Officer Lacey had heard was returning, not as a storm, but as a fleet. Chapter 4. The Black Helicopters. In the summer of 1994, the sky over Washington wasn't just a canvas for rain. It was a corridor. While the people of Oakville were clutching their stomachs and staring at their dead livestock, the silence of the valley was shattered, not by thunder, but by the scream of twin turbofan engines. Imagine the visual style of a 90s military thriller animated with heavy, jagged lines. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, a machine built for titanium-plated destruction, flying low enough to rattle the china in every kitchen cabinet in Grays Harbor County. Records would later show that the 354th Fighter Squadron was active in the region, but the missions they were flying weren't in any public log. They weren't hunting tanks. They were seeding the clouds.
Dispatch, I'm back on Highway 12. You're not going to believe this. I've got 3 helicopters crossing the ridge. They're flying nap of the earth, real low. They're jet black, no markings, no tail numbers. I can't even see the pilots. The air, it feels different when they pass. It's like a static charge. And the smell is back, that metallic ozone scent. They're circling the area where the first blobs were reported. It looks like they're dropping something. Or maybe they're just watching the sickness spread. They aren't here to help. They're here to observe the results.
Military analysts call it a vector delivery system. In the early 90s, the Pentagon was obsessed with the dispersal of biological agents without the use of obvious warheads. A hydrogel matrix, the blobs, would be the perfect shell. It protects the bacteria from UV radiation at high altitudes. It keeps the cells hydrated during the fall. And once it hits the ground, it acts as a slow-release primer, ensuring the payload enters the local water table and the lungs of the population. Oakville wasn't a victim of a freak storm. It was the target of a non-lethal biological field test.
I saw them at the local diner. Men I'd never seen before. They wore these gray, nondescript suits, even in the heat. They didn't eat. They just sat there, drinking black coffee and asking questions. They didn't ask how we were feeling. They asked when we first touched the gel. They asked if the animals died immediately or after a few hours. I saw one of them looking at my hands. I still had some rashes from cleaning the porch. He didn't look concerned. He looked interested, like a kid looking at a bug he'd just stepped on. When I asked who they were with, he just smiled and said they were testing the air quality. Then they got into a black SUV with federal plates and drove toward the restricted ridge. They knew. They knew exactly what was in that rain.
The black helicopter isn't just a trope of 90s paranoia. In Oakville, it was a physical reality that hovered over the dying crows and the sickened children. But as the military presence intensified, the evidence began to vanish. It wasn't just McDowell's slides that disappeared. It was the very memory of the event itself. The purge was beginning. Chapter 5. The Purge. History isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes it is simply erased. By late August 1994, Oakville was no longer a meteorological curiosity. It was a liability. And in the high-stakes game of national security, liabilities have a way of evaporating faster than the morning dew. Imagine the visual of a 1990s government office long after hours, the flickering hum of fluorescent lights, the scent of stale coffee and ozone, and the rhythmic, hungry sound of a heavy-duty paper shredder. Mike McDowell was about to learn that in the world of biological defense, memory is a privilege that can be revoked at any time.
I came back to the lab early that Monday. I'd spent the entire weekend rereading my notes on the leukocytes. I was ready to run a DNA sequencing to prove once and for all where those cells came from. But when I walked to my station, my microscope had been moved. The secure cabinet where I kept the Oakville samples, it was hanging open, empty. There were no signs of a break-in, no shattered glass, just a void. I went to my supervisor's office, my heart pounding against my ribs. I demanded to know where my files were. He looked at me, dead-eyed, and said, "Mike, I don't know what you're talking about. We never received any samples from Oakville." I showed him the delivery logs on my computer. I tried to pull up the database. Access denied. The file had been purged from the central server. In less than 48 hours, weeks of scientific reality had been bleached white. As if the rain had never fallen. As if I had never even looked through that lens.
The purge wasn't limited to the laboratories in Olympia. In the streets of Oakville, the cleanup was far more physical. While the residents were still struggling with the vertigo and the grief of their lost pets, the vans arrived. Plain white, no markings, no identifiable plates. Imagine these gray silhouettes moving through the twilight, scraping the remnants of the gel from the porches and confiscating the private samples that citizens had stored in their freezers. It wasn't a health service. It was a tactical decontamination of the evidence.
They came to my house around 5 in the evening. 2 men in gray suits wearing yellow latex gloves. They didn't ask for permission. They told me they were from the Environmental Protection Department and that they needed to remove the biological debris from my yard. I watched them from the window as they put the dead crows into heavy-duty biohazard bags. One of them saw the jar I'd kept in the kitchen, the one with a piece of the gel I'd collected on the first day. He walked right in, took it off the counter, and just looked at me. He didn't say a word. He just shook his head and walked out. That night, for the first time in weeks, there were no helicopters. There was just this unnatural, heavy silence, like the whole town had been placed in a vacuum. They took away our health, and then they took away our right to remember what did it to us.
Mike McDowell received a phone call that night, a distorted voice suggesting he take a very long vacation and stop talking about human cells or synthetic hydrogels. The truth about Oakville was being sealed in a tomb of bureaucratic secrecy. But DNA has a long memory. And even though the samples were gone, the ghosts of 1994 were about to resurface 30 years later under a different light. The light of a world that has finally learned how to look back. Chapter 6. Dissolving Memories, The Legacy. 30 years. For some, it's a lifetime. For the machines that archive our data, it's just a digital blink. Today, Oakville looks like any other rural town in the Pacific Northwest. The fog still drifts through the Douglas firs, and the rain still rhythmically drums against the wooden rooftops. But beneath the surface of normalcy, 1994 never truly vanished. It simply mutated. In 2025, official science has a ready-made answer for anyone who dares to ask about the Oakville Blobs. They tell us they were agricultural hydrogels, smart polymers used for cloud seeding or to combat forest fires. Inert materials designed to absorb moisture and release it slowly. It's a clean explanation, civilized, reassuring. But the science of 2025 suffers from a strange, selective amnesia. It ignores Mike McDowell's slides. It ignores the human white blood cells. It forgets that polymers don't need black helicopters to fall from the sky.
Sometimes, when the sky turns that specific shade of gray, I still find myself staring at the driveway. They tell me it was all a technical error. An experiment with fertilizers, they say. But fertilizer doesn't make you forget how to walk for 3 months. Fertilizer doesn't kill every bird within miles in a single night. We've become a footnote. A case for mystery podcasts or lovers of analog horror. But for those of us who were here, we know we were just a number on a chart. We were the control group for an experiment we never authorized. The gelatin melted away 30 years ago, but I still feel that metallic taste in the back of my throat every time it rains hard. It's not the memories that are dissolving. It's the belief that there's anything human left in those who watch us from above.
Mike McDowell never stepped back into a microbiology lab. Officer Lacey stopped looking at the sky and took an early retirement. The samples were destroyed, the databases purified. Yet, the question remains like a viscous residue in the collective memory. If that rain was truly an innocent mistake, Why were they so terrified of what a microscope might reveal? Oakville was the dress rehearsal, a test to see how quickly a population can be sickened and how quickly they can be induced to forget. Today, we call those hydrogels sustainable technology. We use them to manipulate the weather, to feed the fields, to protect the forests. We welcome them. But the next time you hear a hum above the clouds, and you see something falling that doesn't look like water, don't open your mouth. Don't touch the gel. And above all, do not trust the explanation they will give you the next morning. This has been Arcana Log. Monitoring session is now terminated. Remember, the sky is not a ceiling. It's a laboratory, and we are not the observers.